This lecture will focus on general background issues for generative AI for video and music, based on what I'm aware of in August 2024, which, of course, is only a fraction of what professionals in these fields are aware of right now, which is itself likely only a fraction of what exists on whatever date it is that you're watching this video in the future. And so I'll first begin with this question: why am I focusing on video and music? So let's think about the arts generally. So Wikipedia gave me this classification of the arts as visual arts, literary arts, and performing arts, and gave me a list of several art forms in each category. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, and I actually had to add fiber arts to this list, things like knitting, crochet, tapestry, as well as distinguishing musical theater and opera from some of the other performing arts. And there's also lots of other things that we might consider arts that aren't really anywhere on this list. And some of these things, like cooking or video games or board games as art, or martial arts or puzzles, they've been discussed recently by philosophers working on the arts, like Barbara Gale Montero and T. Nguyen. But I'll ignore most of those things and just stick with these main ones. Note that there's a few art forms that appear under multiple categories. Shakespeare's plays might be both considered literary art that you read as drama and as performing art that's performed on stage. And film, of course, blurs the line between a visual art and a performing art. When it's something like animation, that's more clearly visual arts. And when it's just a single stationary camera filming some people on a set, that's much more like theater. Now, many of these art forms can already be approached by other well-known generative AI. Large language models aren't really used to write fiction, drama, poetry, or literary nonfiction that anyone wants to read as real art just yet. And diffusion models like DALL-E or Stable Diffusion or Midjourney don't really replace the kinds of drawings, paintings, or photography that people would go to a museum to see. But these large language models and these diffusion models are producing things that might fit into these art forms at well above the level of the average novice human. And they are being used by people who work in these arts and in related fields to draw prototypes, to try out ideas, and to then fill those in with their human skill, often augmented by other computer tools. Now, there's several of these arts that clearly don't have any generative AI for them yet because they all involve the creation of a physical three-dimensional object, whether it's a building or a piece of pottery or a tapestry or a sculpture. It's theoretically possible for a computer to make these things. There are 3D printers and there are robots, but there's not yet a huge amount of research into putting generative artistic abilities into these systems. To the extent that anyone is making computer-generated instances of these artworks, there's humans doing most of the creative work. But it's also worth noting that in the modern world, most of us don't really interact with artwork of these forms in person. We, in fact, rather interact with digital representations of them. That I don't know how many of you have ever seen an actual sculpture of The Thinker by Rodin, but you've probably seen images of that sculpture. And so if something can generate images, that's sort of good enough for a lot of how we interact with this sort of three-dimensional art. But I think it's also worth noting that's what's going on with painting and photography and drawing as well, that most of us and the things that the computer is generating are interacting with these digital representations of the thing and not the drawing or the painting or the photograph itself. And so I think separate from any thoughts that you might have about computer-generated art, it's worth thinking about what's the difference between a physical drawing or painting and the digital representation of that you get on a screen. I think at least sometimes it's absolutely worth getting out from behind the screen, going to a museum and looking at that actual physical object that is the painting or the drawing or even a photograph. That the three-dimensional thing with a natural light color spectrum rather than the RGB color spectrum of a computer screen does have some important differences. And I predict that one unexpected consequence of the rise of computer-generated art will be a countervailing rise in the number of people who actually go to physical museums to look at physical art, rather than relying on printed posters or on-screen images as we have for decades. Now, let's look at these leftover things, these arts that haven't already been covered to some extent by large language models or image generators. And I think all of them can really be approached to some degree or other by imagining them as like a film, like a moving image of the production, or by imagining them as music, aesthetically arranged sounds through time, or in some of these cases, both need to come together. Now, of course, for some of these, they really are, again, properly experienced as three-dimensional performances on a stage. And if there's going to be a real computer-generated version of that, it's going to involve robots. But apart from the true three-dimensionality of these arts, I think the big things that would enable artificial intelligence to participate in all of the arts would be to supplement large language models and diffusion models with some sort of parallel generative models for video and music. So now we might ask, why have generative video and generative music been so much harder than generative text and images? You've probably encountered a lot of generative text and generative images at this point, probably much less generative music or video. And I think maybe the better question in some of these cases is to turn this around. Why have generative text and image been so much easier than generative video and music? Obviously, generative text and image aren't easy. They weren't done in any meaningful sense until the late 2010s, and they've only been really easy for the general public to access starting in 2022, but they are still relatively easier than video and music. And I think, as far as I can tell, there are two very major reasons that contribute to this. One is just there's a huge amount more training data available for text and for images than there is for video and music. Sure, there is a lot of video available on TikTok and YouTube, not to mention Netflix and all the movie studios. And of course, all the music is available on Spotify, and all the traditional radio stations and music recording industry has its own digitized versions of things. But even with all that music and video, that's still much, much less than the amount of text and images that are out there. Even though a prolific musical artist will record hundreds of songs in their lifetime, and prolific filmmakers will make dozens of movies, in the case of text and still images, it's not just the professionals that are making hundreds or dozens of these things. In fact, random members of the public will take a dozen photos at their birthday party and upload them on social media. Or every day they'll make a few hundred-word comment about their feelings about the latest political developments. And they'll do this every day for years. And so there's just so much more text and image available than video and music, even though there is a lot of video and music. But we often don't think about just how much more text and image there is. Now, I think the other major issue is that text and still images just are much simpler inherently than video and music, that they are one or two dimensional structures as opposed to these three or four dimensional structures. So comparing video to still image, I think this is very clear that in a still image, you just need each pixel to work well with the pixels near it horizontally and vertically. Whereas in a video, those pixels don't just need to fit together into a single still two-dimensional image. They need to change from image to image in a way that makes sense. And maybe another way to think about it that's even more important is that when video comes from actually filming some object in the world, or when an image comes from photographing an object in the world, both video and still image often aim to represent a three-dimensional object in a flat two-dimensional screen. And it's often difficult for generative AI to make even a single two-dimensional image that's a plausible projection of a three-dimensional reality. But making a sequence of them in a row that are all individually plausible two-dimensional representations of a real three-dimensional object, and on top of it, that is moving in a realistic way in a three-dimensional space, that just introduces a whole extra layer of complexity. Now, for music, the dimensionality is not quite so high. That music theorists talking about historic music, like this Bach chorale from the 1600s or 1700s, they often talk about music having both a horizontal dimension of the melody that any individual voice is singing or an instrument is playing across time, and a vertical dimension, which is the chords or harmonies that are produced by all the different voices and instruments at the same time. And traditional Western music notation, like these notes on the staff, even if you can't read music, you can tell it's just a two-dimensional flat image. It's got a horizontal line that represents time and a vertical line that represents all the notes at the same time. But there's still important differences between the two-dimensionality of music and the two-dimensionality of a still image. In a still image, the horizontal and vertical dimensions are largely interchangeable. You can see things from multiple angles. While in music, the horizontal dimension of time and the vertical dimension of harmony are completely different. And this sort of structure that the three-dimensional film has and that music has over time suggests a dichotomy of approaches that we might have to generative AI for video or for music. We might try to imitate the generative AI for text and for still images, where you just have a single prompt that directly generates the whole object by an AI. Or we could take the structure of the task seriously. We could use one generative AI to generate a script for a movie or the text, melody, and harmonies of a piece of music. Then use another sort of generative AI to simulate actors in a three-dimensional space or singers and instrumentalists who are producing the sounds that are represented by that notation. And then use a third AI to take that three-dimensional structure or that musical performance and convert it into film or audio. And then use one more AI model to do the video editing or sound editing to put it all together. And in fact, there are currently generative AI projects and other AI projects in music and video working on all of these versions. Now, the ones on the left, directly going from a text to a completed video or piece of music, are mostly, as far as I can tell right now, as of August 2024, just demonstrations in academic papers or teasers on corporate websites. OpenAI has been showing us some hints of this product they're calling Sora that's supposed to generate videos. And Google has released various generative AI that takes text and produces music. As far as I know, as of August 2024, there isn't really a significantly effective version of either of these things that's available for the public to use, and they're not being used directly by anyone who's making AI-generated music or AI-generated video that goes beyond these simple demonstrations. I think the structured approach that's mentioned on the right here is where the real work is being done. And I'll mention a few of the things that are going on. I think some of the most interesting projects are at what I'm calling the second step here of taking some sort of script or notation and turning it into video or audio of performance. There's various text-to-speech synthesizers based on things like transformers that are used for large language models that are now able to generate a variety of voices doing reasonable readings of passages of text with realistic breathing and intonation rather than just the older text-to-speech where there's a way to pronounce each word and they're just strung together. This sort of thing is also connected to the sort of traditional CGI, computer generated imagery that was used in movies like Roger Rabbit or Lord of the Rings to generate characters like Roger Rabbit and Gollum, where a human actor does a performance and then that performance is somehow captured in a way that another face or body is put on top of. And AI is now getting involved in that sort of thing. And so now, if you have enough training video of a particular person moving from a variety of angles, it's now not too hard to use AI to put that person's likeness on the motions of another actor. In most cases, you're still better off having some sort of motion capture from a real actor to supplement the likeness of the individual. But if you're doing something just like a talking head, uh, you might be able to simulate that just from enough training data of people speaking now. And so when all this sort of stuff is done in a plausible way, this is what they call a deep fake. This is a term that goes back to 2017 for a video that somehow uses a deep neural net to make a visually plausible fake video. And if you've seen some AI generated videos going around where famous politicians and tech giants appear to be committing violent crimes and getting arrested, or where uh, long dead singers sound like they're singing uh, songs that other songs that they never sang, or someone's generating new songs in the voice of artists like Drake or The Weeknd. These sorts of things are usually being done in this way, where some human has come up with the script and the action and the music, but they've just used some sort of model to put someone's voice or likeness onto that. And the possibility of this sort of practice played a very important role in some of the major Hollywood strikes in 2023. The Screen Actors Guild, one of the things they specifically requested and were able to win in their strike was a guarantee that actors would be paid not just for the days that they are actually on set filming, but also for the days that they would have been on set filming if their likeness is used by the studio to generate new scenes in the future. So they wanted to make sure that the studios wouldn't just film them once and then make them and then say, goodbye, you live the rest of your life, and we'll just keep making movies with you. Uh, the structure of the music industry is fairly different. There have been some laws passed in a few states to try to give the same sort of protections, but in any case, musicians usually are more likely to own their own likeness than film artists, just because the music industry is structured differently from the film industry. Now, there's also been some interesting and controversial work in film editing on this last step. So for the newest Blu-ray releases of some of his 1980s films like True Lies and Aliens, James Cameron used AI technology in the remastering. So these films, they were actually filmed on physical film in the 1980s. And so the master copies are on film. And after a few decades, that film degrades in various ways. It gets dust and scratches on it. And at previous times when they were converting that film to DVD, human editors would go through the film frame by frame to try to digitally touch up any blemishes that existed on that film master. But in this most recent remaster in 2024, an AI was trained to do that work, to go through the film frame by frame and remove little bits of distortion that had accumulated. And some people think this was a much more effective remaster than the earlier ones, and some people have a lot of criticisms of it. But at any rate, more of this is going to be going on in upcoming years. And it's surely going on in sound editing as well, even though that hasn't been quite as discussed in the public. And now, finally, let me observe that this same issue of whether you want to use a single prompt to generate the whole thing or whether you want to use tools for doing all the steps arise just as much for text and for still image as for video and audio. While there are some art forms like drawing caricature sketches or doing improv comedy, where a person just sits down and creates the art in a single go, almost all visual and literary art, even if it's just a single image or a single text in the end, it begins with a plan, with an outline, with various sketches and drafts, fleshing out trials of various parts, prototyping things, editing things, and then producing the final version. And the existence of generative AI hasn't changed that overall fact for the production of text or the production of images. A lot of working professionals will use large language models to help brainstorm ideas and flesh out paragraphs and polish their text, or they will use diffusion models to produce concept art for an image that they're going to draw, or storyboards, or individual items that they will then edit and use in other ways to create their final product. But this sort of generative AI for text and still images has now reached the point where people who aren't striving for artistic greatness are now willing to use these tools to directly produce the final product. Now, in my own work, as a university professor, the main product that I create is published philosophical articles. And I haven't yet found a large language model that can do anything like produce a paper or even produce full paragraphs that I'm going to use. But I have found it useful for brainstorming ideas, searching for relevant literature, digging through texts to find ideas, prototyping the code for some diagrams in my papers, and so on. Now, another thing that I do is, in addition to writing published papers, I also give lectures like these, and I often incorporate images in my slides. And drawing images is not my primary production. I used to mainly just search for royalty-free images and use those in my slides, but now I often generate them using diffusion models. And this is partly because the images aren't the core product that I'm creating, they're just a visual aid for the thing that is my main product, which is the text or the idea. And I would never have been willing to pay enough to hire a human being to draw pictures specifically for my slides. They're not worth that much. But I can generate images with AI, and that does something for me. And there's conversely various sites on the internet where people are using just large language models to just generate text and put it out there. And these are mainly content farms where the text isn't their main product. The text just needs to be good enough to attract people to look and stay there for a few minutes so that they'll get some ad views. The ad views are the product, not the text. At this point, no one for whom the text or the image is the final product is just directly using a generative AI to produce that. Will these generative AIs reach that level soon? Maybe they will in the next few years. But it does seem likely that professionals in all these fields will still mainly use the AI tools as tools rather than going from text to completed output. We're going to take advantage of the structure in these tasks to make use of our human intelligence, not just the artificial intelligence. But there is one cautionary note to think about at the end. What has been called the bitter lesson in the development of neural nets is that most of the smart ways that humans have come up with to try to take advantage of the structure of projects, to design a better network that will do some more effective AI system, has turned out to be less effective than just use more computing power and more training data. And perhaps this lesson will come in for art as well. Maybe with enough computing power and training data, large language models will be able to replace writers. Maybe diffusion models will be able to replace visual artists. Maybe someday generative video and generative music will be good enough to replace filmmakers and musicians, though that'll surely take longer. I'm currently betting that that won't happen, that somehow humans will need to be involved in structuring and planning the overall idea to make the most valuable artistic creations, with the AI being useful for very quick prototyping. But I definitely can't be sure of any of this.